think we can get started. So thank you very much for joining this flash session. My name is Carl Gomberg. I work with the Internet Society. And today we're going to talk about Internet Impact Assessments, which is something that we initiated as a project a couple of years ago and have been working on ever since. We created a kind of toolkit to make these Internet Impact Assessments. So the purpose of today's session is to give you kind of an introduction to how this impact assessment, how they work, the framework that we've created. And hopefully this will encourage people to either adopt our way of doing impact assessments, but in general, to adopt the approach of doing Internet Impact Assessments, whether it's through our framework or your own kind of approach. I have a long presentation. I don't have like a slotted space for questions at the end. So please, if you have any questions throughout, just raise your hands and we'll address them ongoingly. I wanted to start with giving you kind of an overview of what we'll be talking about today. So first, I'm going to talk about something that we call the Internet way of networking. And the reason why we're calling that and the meaning of that will become clear in a couple of minutes, but kind of short explanation for what we mean by the Internet way of networking is kind of our conceptualization of describing what the Internet is. So the way that we think about the Internet is actually as a way of how you do networking. After that, we're going to talk about something that we call critical properties and enablers. And what they are is effectively important characteristics of the Internet, important characteristics of what makes the Internet open, what makes it trustworthy, etc. And then we're going to look at how to produce one of these impact briefs with a case study that we've done that will kind of take you through how to use this toolkit in practice and how to analyze policies. So I wanted to start with giving you a little bit of background to why we started this work a couple of years ago. And the inspiration that we took was actually from a different policy field, namely the environmental policy field. And when you look at sort of environmental policy, there's a very clear image that guides environmental policy. You can kind of summarize it here as you see on the image here, that you have one future that is basically this dystopian future to the left, where we ruin the planet, and then we have a more utopian future or a promising future to the right here. That is the kind of thing that we're striving for. But we can have these kind of clear mental images of what does it mean to do good environmental policy. Well, we're striving for the thing on the right-hand side here. And when it comes to environmental policy, we have a number of different sort of policy measures that helps us move towards the greener side of the image that you can see there. So we have things like recycling. We have things like innovative electrical vehicles. We have things like policy concepts like the green economy that is meant to sort of help us transition our economic activities into more environmentally friendly things. We have, of course, large international discussions like COP26 and others to discuss how can we address these environmental targets. We have activists in this space. We have organizations like Greenpeace that are out there and sort of physically preventing some of the activities that are harming the Internet, or sorry, the environment. And then, of course, I'm a Swede myself. We also have Greta Thunberg, who's a very important voice for the environment in this space. But something that is not on the screen here and that is actually proven to be very, very important over the past 50, 60 years of environmental policy is the practice of doing impact assessments. And the notion of an impact assessment is quite straightforward, and you can sort of picture it through the image that you see here. So ideally, when someone built this highway here, you would have done an impact assessment of how does that impact the forest to the left-hand side here. And in many countries today, this is sort of part of the standard operating procedure that when we are in some way or another potentially doing harm to the environment, we do these impact assessments to try to give us an understanding of the impact that it will have, how we can mitigate those impacts, etc. So we took some inspiration from this and said, basically, what if we could do this, but for the Internet? What if we could do the sort of analogous thing, but for the Internet? What they are doing in the environmental space, and that has proven to be very successful in environmental policy, what if we could do that for the Internet? So that was kind of the background to the work when we started this. And the solution that we came up with basically came in two steps. So the first step kind of goes to that image that you saw in the beginning about the environment having sort of a dystopian future and a promising future. And step one means that we need to kind of articulate what the internet is, what makes a flourishing internet, in order to describe how you can strengthen it. If we don't have an idea to think about the internet, if we don't have a picture of what the internet is or what makes it stronger, we won't be able to do these impact assessments. So that's where we started first, to try to articulate what really makes the internet the internet. The second step here was to provide the tools. So once we've kind of articulated and tried to describe what makes the internet and what makes it so successful, etc., we need to provide people with the tools to help analyze how different changes impact the internet. So this was kind of a two-step solutions. We started with step one, trying to articulate what makes the internet, and then we built this toolkit that helps you analyze these changes vis-a-vis the internet. So the output of this work became what we call the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. Now, when we talk about a toolkit, that can sound like it's something very complex and very big, etc. But the toolkit that we created basically have three parts. The first part of the toolkit you can think about as a baseline for your assessment. And that baseline is basically documents that are describing what makes the internet, what helps make the internet open, what makes it trustworthy, etc. And they're kind of describing this ideal, imagine again like that ideal picture of the environment. It helps you articulate what makes it, how does a good internet look like? So that creates a baseline. And then we have a methodology that helps you describe how to make these assessments vis-a-vis this baseline. And then we also have created a collection of impact assessments, which is kind of the output. Once you've analyzed the policy or technology and you've written up your assessment, you write it up in one of these internet impact briefs, and then you can share those with the rest of the community. So the goal here is really to build a repository of assessments that can be helpful for a global community. So for instance, from the Internet Society's perspective, we might create an impact assessment ourselves. We've had our chapters produce internet impact assessments. And usually in the internet policy space, you actually have things sort of echoing across the world. So an assessment that our Brazilian chapter has made, for instance, might be relevant for our chapters in Europe or might be relevant for our chapters in Asia. So it helps sort of spread learnings and information across the world about what's going on and help share these analyses and promoting what sort of makes good policy for the internet. But I wanted to start with, if you go back to what I talked about, that first step that we did about trying to articulate what makes the internet the internet. And that might sound like a fairly straightforward question, but it's actually quite hard to pinpoint what is the internet. There isn't a sort of universally accepted definition out there about what is the internet or a detailed description of it. So that was actually a pretty hard first step, but there is some descriptions of the internet that is helpful to start from. So you might have heard this expression that the internet is a network of networks. So if you were to sort of visualize what that means, is that you have this interconnection of computer networks, and somehow the interconnection of that creates what we call the internet. Now, that is sort of a useful starting point for describing what the internet is, but it sort of lacks a lot of detail. It doesn't really tell us the whole story about what makes the internet really the unique thing that it is. So what we kind of did was to start from this image, and then we started to try to think about like, okay, so this is a useful starting point, but what additional details would we want to point out that makes the internet unique? Just saying that it's a network of networks is a helpful starting point, but it's not sufficient to kind of really describe the unique characteristics of the internet. And what we came up with is basically what we call critical properties. So we think about, as I mentioned, the internet as a networking model. So as I mentioned, the internet at this high level is a description of a network of networks. You can think about that as a particular way of interconnecting these networks, a networking model. That's what we think about the internet, what it is. So it's a model for how you interconnect these networks. And part of that model, what you're striving for when you're creating that internet, is that it should exhibit what we call critical properties that really defines the internet as a networking model, and what we've learned being sort of the fundamental characteristics of the internet when we look back, say, 30, 40 years. So the first thing that sort of characterized this networking model that we call the internet is that it's a very accessible infrastructure with a common protocol. So what does that mean? Well, at the very basic idea of it, it means that you have the internet protocol as the common protocol for interconnecting these networks. You could imagine a different networking model where you had a bunch of different communications protocols and you had basically translators between these. But what you do on the internet is that you're striving for all of these independent networks to actually make use of the same protocol in order to have interoperability and have sort of end-to-end communications. So the use of a common protocol is actually an essential feature of the internet and something that you need to have in order to have sort of call it the internet. Now, the sort of observant listener here might point out that we actually have more than one internet protocol in use today. We have what's known as Internet Protocol version 4 and version 6. So that is just to highlight that when we're describing these critical properties here, they're trying to articulate the kind of ideal state of the internet. The reality might look different, and the reality does look different today when you look at the fact that the internet today is actually interconnected using two protocols, IPv4 and IPv6. But the fact that you've had problems transitioning between IPv4 and IPv6, it's actually a testament to the fact that you're striving for one protocol, because no one wants to be left on the protocol that the rest of the world doesn't use. So that explains why the transition has been so hard. But if you're doing networking the internet way, you should be striving for the use of one protocol. That's sort of the ideal that you're working towards. So that's the first critical property. And an accessible infrastructure, it comes down to the fact that the internet protocol is an open standard you can adopt, and you can become part of the global internet. The second critical property when you're doing networking the internet way is that you have a common set of global identifiers. And again, this is some sort of familiar things that people will recognize. So IP addressing, you have a shared system for IP addressing. You have a shared domain name system that helps you translate names to addresses. And that's quite intuitive, that you need a shared addressing system to find your way on this interconnection of networks. It's kind of like if you were to have an addressing system in the physical world and you started to making use of two different addressing systems in the same village. So like this address here would actually be known under two names. That would be very confusing if we try to make our way around the city. So having a shared common identifier system, that is a critical property of the internet. And if you start having more than one, then you start fragmenting the internet, basically. Another critical property of the internet is what is known down here is that you have a layered architecture of interoperable and reusable building blocks. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but it comes down to the fact that when you work with internet technologies, you're effectively do it in what you could think about as a technology neutral approach. So we talked about in the early, or just a couple of minutes ago, the fact that we have two internet protocols in place, IPv4 and IPv6. And what that tells us is that all of the technologies that are involved in the internet, they can actually be upgraded, updated over time. It might change over time. So you can think about this as basically a technical stack of Lego blocks that you can sort of take out, you can upgrade, put something in, and update the network over time. And this is something that we've seen happening. And one of the sort of main examples of this that is happening right now is that what has been the sort of TCP IP protocol suite that has been the dominant thing for the internet for the past 30 years is actually being updated at this time with a new protocol called QUIC. So that's kind of an example of technologies can evolve over time within the internet architecture. So that's another important critical property, that you have this layered architecture that can be upgraded over time. The fourth critical property here about decentralized management and distributed routing, that is to describe that because you're interconnecting what is effectively independent networks, they're independent organizations that choose to collaborate. You don't have a central authority that tells those networks what to do, but they need to collaborate somehow. And the way to do that is that you make use of a routing system that is highly decentralized and distributed, that effectively allows these networks to make local decisions, but in a globally coordinated way. So the decentralized management of the internet and having this distributed routing is a critical property of the internet. Now, finally, the last critical property that we highlight is this notion of a general purpose network. And you can think about this from kind of a net neutrality discussion, that the internet was really built for everything and nothing. It's agnostic to whatever it's transporting on top. And that is really an incredibly important property of the internet that is really a feature of the network. It's sometimes you hear people complaining that, oh, you know, a cat video is getting the same priority as a health application of the internet. And for those reasons, we need to kind of change the internet architecture to give priority to certain communications over others. But what people are missing is that the fact that the internet has sort of disconnected the network service from the service on top means that if you're innovating on this network, we can all start from the same assumption that the application that I'm building is going to be able to get the exact same sort of service quality as the next application. I don't need to think about how, well, for instance, I don't need to think about contracting with the different networks out there to make sure that I get a certain service quality. So that's actually an incredibly important property of the internet, and actually a feature of the internet, that it has this general purpose characteristics and treat the data communications equally, independent of the content of the data packet. So what does all of that mean? Well, it means that if we can describe the internet way of networking, our way of thinking about the internet through these critical properties, it basically tells us what the internet needs to exist. So if we take away one of these critical properties, then we start eroding this wonderful thing that we have that we call the internet. If you start taking away, for instance, the idea that you have a layered architecture, if you start taking away the fact that the internet is a general purpose network, or if you take away the common identifier systems, if you start taking those away, then you will lose the internet, because you need those to have the internet being in existence. So with those critical properties, you can think about them from this way, that let's say that we have a vision. This is the vision of my organization at the Internet Society. We have a vision for an internet that is open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy internet. And that's a vision that I think many organizations share and many stakeholders share with us. And the way to think about it is that in that vision, you can think about the internet way of networking, what I've just articulated with those critical properties. They're kind of describing the goal for the internet piece there. In order to have the internet, we need to have the goal of this internet way of networking. And those critical properties are basically elements of that goal. So when you're putting this together, it kind of helps us operationalize from this high-level vision statement, okay, open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy internet. What does that mean in practice? Well, we can start by saying that for the internet part, you need to have a networking model that corresponds to this internet way of networking. It sort of helps us operationalize that vision piece of the internet by articulating as the internet way of networking and by describing those critical properties that are the elements of that internet way of networking. It helps us sort of go from this very abstract and lofty description of a vision statement to something much more concrete that we can analyze things against. So yeah, the internet way of networking kind of corresponds to that internet part. So this is just a very quick kind of recap of what we just talked about, kind of a cheat sheet for what these critical properties are. But as kind of an important reminder is that this internet way of networking and the critical properties that we're describing, they're really expressed in their ideal state. We're talking about them in the ideal sort of utopian way of thinking about what they should look like. The reality could look different. But the benefit of describing them in the ideal state is that we create kind of a stable baseline against which we can assess things. So it's very purposeful reason for why we're describing it in the ideal. If we try to describe the internet as it looks at any point in time, we would kind of go crazy, because we would need to update that, you know, every minute, basically. So we're describing the internet in its ideal state in order to have this stable reference point, and then we can assess, are we moving towards or away from these ideals that we've articulated? But kind of to recap the basic idea behind these critical properties. So when we talk about an accessible infrastructure with a common protocol, we're basically saying that all networks and computers speak the same language. and it's easy to become part of the internet. If you have that critical property, then you're on a good way of having the internet way of networking. And for the second critical property, sort of a reminder of why this idea of a common global identifier system, why that's important. Well, if you have two addresses for the same building, it's very confusing. So we kind of need to have a common identifier system in order to avoid this confusion, because with that confusion comes fragmentation. The third critical property here, a layered architecture, the kind of reminder what that means is that you should be able to puzzle together technologies to build new technologies. The internet shouldn't be this sort of stale thing that cannot be updated over time. It shouldn't be described by sort of vertical integration of things. No, you should be able to update the network over time and adapt it to new use cases, for instance. Decentralized management, there's no centralized authority, but local decisions for local needs. You want an internet in the internet for your local network to be able to make the decisions that is best for it. It shouldn't be some central authority out there that tells your network how to best serve its customers. And finally, this general purpose network, the internet just moves bits and bytes. It's designed for nothing and everything. And that is a very important feature. We shouldn't lose that feature. So that was sort of a recap of this internet way of networking that describes what the internet needs to exist. But the question here is, what does the internet need to thrive? So you can think about the things that I just described about the critical properties. There's sort of the necessary conditions that you need to have an internet, but they're not sufficient in and of themselves to create a open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy internet. In order to have those sort of ideals or those thriving state of the internet, you might need to think about it from a different set of lens. And this is where our second document comes in. And that second document tries to articulate what does it mean to have an open internet? What does it mean to have a globally connected internet, secure and trustworthy internet? So again, the internet way of networking, that document kind of tells you what makes it the internet. And this next document that I'll talk about kind of helps you explain, or helps you understand what makes an open internet, what makes a globally connected internet. So we call this document Enablers of an Open, Globally Connected, Secure, and Trustworthy Internet. And again, the approach is kind of similar to that internet way of networking document, namely that you take one of these fairly high level and abstract concepts like open or globally connected, secure, and trustworthy, and basically try to identify its constitutive parts, the things that you need to assemble together in order to reach things like an open internet. So kind of give you a sense of why we're doing this is that all of those goals that I just described, sort of an open internet, a globally connected internet, secure, et cetera, they're kind of goals high up in the treetops. We might never really reach a perfectly secure internet. We might never reach a perfectly open internet. But the enablers, these elements that we're talking about, they're sort of helping you reach towards that goal. So you can think about an enabler as almost this ladder that if you have a healthy enabler, if you work to strengthen an enabler, it will bring you closer to the goal. You might never reach a perfectly open internet or perfectly secure internet, but if you strengthen these enablers, it will make you sort of get closer to that vision that you have. So starting with one of those sort of high-level abstract concepts of an open internet. So I've summarized here how we think about that. What does it mean to have an open internet? Well, first of all, people and organizations that are on the internet, they should be able to mix and match technologies. They should be able to do that without permission from some central authority that tells them what they can and cannot do. And they should be able to do that with minimum barriers. And again, this is the ideal version, right? In the ideal state, this is what it should look like. And there are a couple of benefits from striving towards this type of openness. Well, it gives you innovation, and it can promote an internet that is a force for good. So if you were to summarize this, an open internet is basically an accessible internet. It's easy to connect to the internet and to become part of it and to use its services. If we strive towards that, we're striving towards an open internet. So when we took this concept of an open internet, we broke it down into having three constitutive parts, three enablers. So the first one is that an enabler of an open internet is easy and unrestricted access. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means in practice, but it's effectively, as a user or as an organization, it should be easy to become part of the internet and to use the internet. If we strive towards that thing, then we strive towards having an open internet. Second here, collaborative development, management, and governance. This goes very directly to the question around multi-stakeholder governance. If we have an open and collaborative management and governance of the internet, that means that it's open for more participants to participate in important questions, like, for instance, the allocation of domain names or allocation of IP addresses that will have an impact on people's use of the internet. So governance is another important component of an open internet. Third here, unrestricted use and deployment of internet technologies. Basically, again, as we talked about, not only for the sort of networking technologies for the internet, you should be able to do this, but also for applications on the internet, you should be able to mix and match things. For instance, things like the use of open standards for applications, open source for applications. Those are all things that help create a more open internet experience. So if you look at one of those, for instance, the easy and unrestricted access here, that's one of the enablers. And the description here is that it should be easy to become part of the internet for networks and users. For users, it should be affordable, and internet services should be accessible. And for the networks, they should be easily be able to become part of the global internet. So what we do in this document is basically, we start by describing why an enabler is important. Through these descriptions, we outline questions that kind of goes to the ideal state. So for instance, here, does the proposed change, let's say that you have a policy or a law, does that create or lower barriers to entry, such as cost, administrative overhead, or other difficulties? So if you have a policy that basically increase costs or administrative overhead, making it sort of the barriers to entry to the internet increase, well, then you know that this particular policy is working against an open internet. And you can kind of articulate why. You can describe that this particular policy that increases access prices, it works against an open internet because it undermines easy and unrestricted access. Other examples of things that sort of makes it easier to become part of the internet and use the internet, and we had a session right before this one that had to do about accessibility guidelines. So another perfect example of this is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines from W3C. It's a positive example. So what that is about is basically websites adopting best practices such as alt text to images. So if you're using a screen reader, let's say that you're blind and you're using a screen reader, that screen reader can get that picture described to it. Now, policies that sort of work towards the use of those type of guidelines, let's say a government service that makes sure to include a requirement of web content accessibility guidelines, that is effectively something that is working towards an open internet because it allows more people to become part of the internet. It lowers barriers for a larger group of people to actually make use of the internet. So it's a positive example, sort of reflect on that. Okay, this particular policy that supports web content accessibility guidelines, it is something that is sort of working towards an open internet because it helps improve easy and unrestricted access. Now, this is just a summary of the 4 goals that you see here: open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy, and the associated enablers. So again, the enablers are these things like privacy, accountability, reliability, or like the 3 that we talked about: easy and unrestricted access, collaborative governance, etc. Those enablers, as I mentioned, they should be thought about as those kind of constitutive parts of the bigger concept. So if you take secure, the constitutive parts of having a secure internet is that you have enablers of data confidentiality of information, and you have enablers of integrity of that information. If you strive towards those enablers, then you're making good progress towards having that goal of a secure internet. So it's a way, again, to kind of operationalize these very high, lofty goals around open, secure, trustworthy by concretizing what do we actually mean by it. Well, when we're talking about a secure internet, we're talking about an internet that offers data confidentiality, that offers integrity of information. So we can puzzle this in that sort of framework that I just showed earlier. So again, you take that sort of high-level vision of an open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy internet. You can break it down into its goals, and then you can start operationalizing those goals by breaking down the elements of those goals. So critical properties for the internet way of networking, or enablers for those other open, globally connected. And again, the purpose here is to try to become more concrete about how something, a policy or technology, impacts that long-term vision. Because we've now broken it down into more sort of digestible parts. So when we see a new policy and we say that, oh, this is bad for the security of the internet, we can actually trace why that is bad for the internet, because we know what are the components of a secure internet. And we can show that if a given policy helps improve the integrity of information or the confidentiality of information, then that policy is helping make a more secure internet. If it impacts them negatively, we can say actually it has a negative impact on the security of the internet. So that's just a recap of the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit that you see here. And it might sound like it would be sort of very complicated to make these impact assessments, but it really isn't. You can think about it as a checklist type of thing. So the way you approach this is that you take a given policy or technology, you describe what the effect of it is. So for instance, when you're just reading a legal text, it's not necessarily, like the legal text might not say, that it might not include explicit provisions that doesn't allow you to use encryption, for instance. So you would first need to analyze the legal text and perhaps conclude that given these provisions, you won't be able to make use of encryption online. So you sort of analyze first the legal impact and the effect of that. In this case, you're prohibited from using encryption. And then you take that effect and you try to describe what the impact is on these critical properties. So once you've done that, so if you take that case of encryption, for instance, and you analyze, okay, one of the consequences from this law is that it prohibits you from using end-to-end encryption. Once we've concluded that, then we can start mapping out, okay, so if you cannot use end-to-end encryption, how does this affect critical properties, for instance? Does it move us closer or further away from the goal, the ideal state of that critical property? And you ask yourself that almost like a checklist for all of the critical properties and for all of the enablers. So in some cases, you won't see any effect at all, right? So for instance, the use of a common protocol and accessible infrastructure, the fact that I'm prohibited from using encryption is not going to have an impact on that critical property. But for an enabler like security or trustworthiness, I can quite easily say that if I'm not able to use end-to-end encryption, the integrity and confidentiality of my information is likely to be undermined, so it's going to have a negative effect on that thing. So again, I treat it as like a checklist. I look for each of these critical properties and enablers. What is the likely effect? Is it going to be positive, moving it sort of closer to the ideal that we articulated, or further away? So again, a checklist, that's how you think about it. I'm sort of approaching the end of the presentation here. So before going into the case study, is there any questions about this that I could help with now? Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if you are able to track organizations or institutions that use this toolkit to analyze the impact of certain policies.
Yes and no. So one way that we're encouraging people to use this is that if they use our toolkit and write up one of these internet impact briefs, they can submit it to us and we will review it and publish it on our website. And that's, again, an attempt of sort of spreading the knowledge about different policies and the impact of them. So we're striving to create that repository, and we really encourage other organizations that ISOC to produce these. We've had chapters and civil society organizations participate with us writing them. We have a couple where ISOC has not been involved and they've been produced by an external party, I think mainly chapters. So those we can keep track of when they get submitted to us. But for others that sort of use the toolkit, use the analysis without writing it up in this particular content category that we call internet impact briefs, that we're sort of struggling to track. We have seen sort of instances of that, but where they reference the sort of background documents. But the ones that we can more closely track are when they're written up as an impact brief. Yes.
I'm Carl's colleague from the Internet Society. Nice to meet all of you. An example from the EU we have is that the Libe committee requested the Parliament Research Service to do an assessment of internet impact. So in that case, they didn't use our template, but we felt that the kind of thinking went into the request for internet. So there are also some examples like that, where we can't prove that they used the template, but definitely the thinking kind of was involved in the government policy.
Yeah, and part of it, as Callum mentioned, like what we really want to see is stakeholders and governments to take on this approach of thinking it like internet impact assessments. That's really the main message here, to do impact assessments. Of course, we've created a framework that we think is the best one, perfectly articulates the internet, what it means, and what are the important characteristics of the internet. So of course, we would like people to use our framework, but we also recognize that people might have disagreements on some things that we're describing in our framework. And in that instance, it's better that people make impact assessments, make clear why they think something impacts the internet or not, because it's in the end a means of accountability. And that's why it's been so successful in the environmental space, is because you can use it as a means of accountability. If a government has made an impact assessment, let's say about building a new highway, and they conclude that, okay, building this highway is gonna, drive a bird out of the woods, and that's gonna be harmful for the environment, then that is a clear choice that the government is making. They're making, okay, we're gonna cause harm to the internet or to the environment by building this highway. And we can make that transparent to the rest of the public that we acknowledge that we're gonna make harm to the internet or it's hurt to the environment, but we're gonna do it anyway. And in some cases, the populace might find, okay, that is reasonable. It might be reasonable to harm the biodiversity in that forest and for the purpose of having a highway, but in other cases, we might not find it acceptable. But at least we become aware about the trade-offs by making these impact assessments. And it's the same rationale that we want to include for the internet, that we shouldn't just be making policies and then 5 years down the road, oh, this had a harmful effect on the internet. No, we should be able to describe what the potential harms and potential benefits are from the starting point in order to have policymakers or decision makers being accountable for those decisions. They know that this given policy will have this negative impact in this way. Yes.
I know that it probably depends on a case-by-case scenario, but for example, if a certain aspect of a policy does not, if you ask the question and you realize it doesn't assist to open internet, is there somewhere a document of Internet Society that can provide suggestions on how to change the policy to maybe address it and foster this internet that we want?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So one way to think about this is you can think about advocacy as having like a chain of steps. Like first is that you want to identify what is a potential threat, and stakeholders, we usually have a network of colleagues or partners that might help us flag that, oh, in this country there is a law being proposed about XYZ that might be problematic. The next step would be to analyze what is the actual consequences of this law, why would it be harmful or why might it be good? And that's really where this comes in, to give you the kind of analysis of why something is good or bad. Now, of course, the next step in the advocacy cycle is to take your results and try to go out and affect change. This impact assessment toolkit doesn't give you the answers to that. But at ISOC, we do have those type of trainings, advocacy trainings, where we share how we approach it. We have we call a FAST model of advocacy, where we sort of try to have a systematic way of how we do advocacy. So it doesn't tell you how to actually affect the change. It really gives you the analysis of what is good or bad. And then what you do with that analysis, how you try to communicate that, or how you try to affect change with that analysis. That's sort of outside of the toolkit and the next step. Yeah.
I am also Carl and Callum with the Internet Society. But one thing I want to point out is that in the writing together, as Carl just mentioned, we do have courses. There is an online course portfolio on impact assessment, and it will help guide you how to build one. And but you did use the word review earlier, that you submit submit it to us and we will review it. Can you explain what that review means? Do we correct it? Do we help them write it?
Yes, I mean, it's really a review just to include it in our repository. Of course, you can make an analysis with this framework and not submit it to us, but you've made your analysis, you made your arguments, so you're presenting it in your own document, for instance. So the review that we do is only to include it in our repository. And the reason that we do that is that we want to make sure that, for instance, the interpretation of the enablers or the critical properties, our understanding of what they mean, is sort of coherent, and that there's a consistency between these impact briefs of, for instance, how does, if we take the case that we talked about, the inability to use end-to-end encryption, which critical properties do they affect and how? We want to make sure that that is accurately articulated. That's why we're reviewing it to be included in our repository. But it's, again, the review is only to have it included in our repository. Do please feel free to use this impact assessment toolkit, produce your own analyses. But if you want to have it published on our website, then you can send it to us and we will review it and just, double check that the analysis is sort of in line with how the framework is to be used. I see that we're at the end of the session. I will be around if anyone has any questions about this, and I do encourage you to have a look at our website. If you're not interested in writing an assessment, I highly recommend reading the impact briefs that we have produced. I think we have almost close to 20 in there, and they're from really all parts of the world, analyzing policies in India, in Brazil, in Nigeria, in Bangladesh, in Europe. So it's a really cool repository of just insights of different policy issues across the world, and analyses in there as examples of how those different policies affect the internet. So take a look at our website, and I really encourage you to at minimum read those briefs and see if this might be something that you're interested in doing. Oh yeah, we do have some swag here that you're free to take before you're leaving the room now. So it's down here on the chair if you want something. Right, thank you all very much.
Thank you.